The Illyrians are not a household name. They don't have the Hollywood treatment of the Romans, nor the endless myths of the Greeks. You won't find their sagas turned into Netflix dramas just yet. But for centuries, they were masters of their rugged world, stretching across the Balkans, ruling the highlands and the islands, and shaping the destiny of the Adriatic. Their story is less polished marble and more weathered rock, yet somehow that makes it even more human, more real. So who were these people? Ancient writers gave us glimpses to the Greeks. The Illyrians were dangerous neighbors, sometimes trade partners, sometimes pirates, often a headache. To the Romans, they were fierce foes, then stubborn allies, and eventually loyal soldiers who bled for the empire on distant frontiers. To themselves, they were tribes and clans bound to mountain, river, and sea, each with its own proud name: Delmatae, Liburni, Ardii, Taulantii. Taken together, they form a chorus of voices we can still just barely hear if we listen hard enough. Our sources are fragmentary. A line in a Greek historian here, a Roman complaint about piracy there, and more solid than parchment, the mute testimony of stone walls and graves dug into Balkan soil. Archaeologists have pulled stories from clay pots, from sword hilts, from the weathered bones of warriors buried with their jewelry. It's a puzzle, with missing pieces, yes, but one that still manages to show the shape of a remarkable civilization. Picture the Illyrians' homeland. It was vast, stretching from the Julian Alps in what is now Slovenia, all the way down to southern Albania and the mountains of Epirus. That's a long corridor of rugged coastlines, dense forests, deep valleys, and high peaks. The sea offered endless islands, perfect hideouts for seafarers. The mountains offered fortresses that seemed built by the earth itself. If the Greeks had their open seas and the Romans their fertile plains, the Illyrians had a homeland made of stone, storm, and shadow, and they learned to thrive in it. This is where our story begins, in that landscape where the boundary between land and water blurs, where mountain fortresses gazed down at traders' ships, where clans guarded pastures and ports alike. Imagine the soundscape: goats' bells clinking in the highlands, hammers ringing against bronze in smoky workshops, and the distant creak of oars cutting through salt water. All of it stitched together into daily life, part harsh, part beautiful, and entirely their own. And yes, they did have a bit of a reputation. Later, Greek writers often painted them as warlike, even savage. Romans naturally doubled down on this stereotype. After all, calling your enemies uncivilized is the oldest propaganda trick in the book. But behind those descriptions lies something more nuanced, a people who could farm the rocky hillsides with skill, who built ships so fast and light they outmaneuvered Roman triremes, and who raised kings and queens capable of defying empires, at least for a time. The Illyrians also lived at a crossroads. To their north were the Celts, pushing into the Balkans with their iron weapons and restless migrations. To the east, the Thracians, another mountain people with their own fierce traditions. To the south, the Greeks, sophisticated, talkative, endlessly writing about themselves, and occasionally about the folks next door. And to the west, across the Adriatic, lay Italy, destined to send its legions across the sea and change everything. Being in the middle meant constant contact, conflict, and cultural exchange. The Illyrians borrowed, adapted, and resisted in equal measure. Tonight, though, let's let the Roman and Greek labels fade into the background. Instead, let's wander into the mists of the Adriatic and try to see the Illyrians as they saw themselves, not as barbarians in someone else's story, but as a people carving out a life in stone fortresses, sailing sleek ships across island-studded seas, and leaving behind a legacy far greater than most remember. So settle in. Imagine the mountains darkening under a twilight sky, the Adriatic shimmering in silver moonlight. Somewhere a bonfire crackles in an Illyrian hilltop fortress, voices chanting hymns to gods, we can no longer name. And with that glow as our guide, we step into their world, the beginning of the long, tangled, fascinating history of the Illyrians. If we trace history like threads in a tapestry, the Illyrians don't burst onto the scene with a neat single thread. They creep in gradually, strand by strand, until suddenly around 2000 BC, we begin to notice something distinctive in the weave of the Balkans. Pottery changes shape. Weapons take on new forms. Settlements shift in style and size. And little by little, the archaeological record begins whispering, here is something new, something recognizably Illyrian. But of course, the Illyrians didn't call themselves Illyrians. That was a name pinned on them later, by outsiders, by Greeks, then Romans. To themselves, they were the Delmatae, or Liburni, or Ardii, or Taulantii. Each tribe had its own story, its own mountains, its own heroes. Yet step back, and the threads connect. Across what is now Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Albania, and beyond, a cultural family emerges distant cousins who shared pottery designs, burial customs, and ways of life that marked them as one of the most enduring peoples of ancient Europe. How did they arrive? That's the tricky part. Archaeology and linguistics point to broader Indo-European movements spreading through the Balkans during the Bronze Age. Imagine waves of peoples moving, settling, blending with earlier inhabitants, reshaping traditions. Out of that slow churn, a new cultural identity crystallized. It wasn't like a dramatic invasion where one group kicks the door down and declares new landlords in town. Instead, it was gradual, almost geological. Think of a shoreline being reshaped by centuries of tides. By 2000 BC, the contours of Illyrian culture were forming distinct, yet layered upon older local roots. Let's talk about pottery, because in the absence of written texts, pots are the gossip column of archaeology. At sites like Vucedol in Croatia or Gradina on the Bosna River, archaeologists noticed changes in ceramic design. Vessels grew larger, sturdier, often decorated with geometric motifs. Handles were shaped into animal heads, stylized bulls and horses that stare at us across 3 millennia with eerie familiarity. These weren't just functional jars. They carried meaning, symbolism, maybe even religious weight. Shared designs across hundreds of miles suggest that Illyrian tribes weren't isolated villages, but a connected cultural sphere. Alongside pottery came metallurgy. The Bronze Age was, after all, the original tech boom. Communities mastered the difficult art of smelting copper and alloying it with tin, an ingredient often sourced from far away. That meant trade connection networks stretching beyond their mountains. The Illyrians became skilled bronze workers, producing not only tools and weapons, but also ornaments that blended practicality with artistry. The gleam of a finely cast fibula, a kind of brooch, or the balanced curve of a spearhead told the world here were craftsmen of considerable skill. But perhaps most revealing are their settlements. The Illyrians did not live in sprawling plains like the Mesopotamians or Egyptians, nor in tight urban clusters like the early Greeks. Their world was dictated by geography. Along the coast, settlements hugged harbors and rocky coves. At Issa, modern Vis Island, archaeologists found stone-lined anchorages and even the suggestion of primitive lighthouse foundations, tiny beacons guiding seafarers long before Romans made lighthouses famous. Inland things looked different. In Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Montenegro, fortified settlements sprouted atop ridges and plateaus. These were the famous Opita hill forts that crowned mountains with walls of stone. Some, like Dorsen, enclosed entire communities, complete with storage areas, craft workshops, and what might even have been administrative centers. The Illyrians in their fortresses were already experimenting with what we'd call proto-urban life. It wasn't a uniform story. Coastal Illyrians had one foot in the sea building sturdy limestone houses designed to withstand the fierce bora winds, their lives tied to fishing boat building and maritime trade. Inland Illyrians perched above valleys, living as herders, and farmers their fortresses positioned to watch over trade routes or mountain passes. Two environments, two strategies, but both under the umbrella of an emerging Illyrian identity. And then there are the graves. Burial customs offer a strangely intimate window into how a culture saw itself. Earlier, Bronze Age communities had often practiced cremation. The Illyrians began shifting toward inhumation, burying the body intact, usually aligned on a north-south axis, as though even in death they wanted to keep their bearings. At necropolises like Glasenac, archaeologists uncovered stone-lined chambers, filled not only with human remains, but with grave goods, bronze weapons, jewelry jars of food and drink. Some graves were modest, others lavish, hinting at social hierarchies already forming. The afterlife, it seems, was not a democratic place. The grave goods themselves sparkle with meaning. Spears with elongated sockets, swords with ornate pommels, axes engraved with geometric designs, all carefully placed beside the dead. Were these tools for the journey beyond status symbols, for eternity, or simply prized possessions buried with their owners? Jewelry complicates the picture, even more bronze, fibulae with intricate designs, amber beads imported from the Baltic, and sometimes gold inlays requiring extraordinary skill. The presence of such exotic items tells us two things. First, that the Illyrians had access to long-distance trade. Second, that not everyone got to enjoy it. A wealthy elite was emerging, marked in life by ornament and in death by treasure. So we see them in these early centuries: coastal seafarers, mountain herders, fort builders, metal workers, potters, and traders. A people in formation. The Greeks, of course, hadn't yet written them into the margins of history, and Rome was still a cluster of huts on the Tiber. To outsiders, they were invisible, but in their own world, they were establishing patterns, settlement, trade, warfare, and ritual that would endure for centuries. Imagine, if you will, a young Illyrian in 1800 BC. He wakes in a stone hut within a hill fort, smoke curling from the central hearth. Outside, goats bleat in their pens. His father is already sharpening a bronze blade, checking the rivets, preparing for the season's cattle raids, or perhaps for defense against a rival clan. His mother fastens her cloak with a fibula shaped like a spiral, amber beads glinting at her throat. Traders from the coast are expected later that week, carrying salt shells, maybe a hint of gossip from the islands. And looming over all of it, the mountains, ancient, watchful, and eternal, forming the walls of the Illyrian world. It's tempting to think of them as peripheral shadow people on the edge of Greek glory and Roman power. But by 2000 BC, they were already writing their own story in stone and bronze. We may not have their words, but we have their work, their walls, their graves. And they whisper, "We were here first, carving our lives into mountains and harbors long before Rome dreamed of empire." In this chapter of their history, the Illyrians are like a dawn sky, shadows of what they will become, hints of brilliance in their pottery, fortresses, and ornaments. The light is just beginning to rise over the Adriatic, and though the Greeks and Romans are not yet watching, the Illyrians are already stepping into their place in the long human story. The Illyrian world was one of contrasts stitched together from two very different landscapes. On one side, the sea, endless blue, stretching westward, studded with rocky islands like stepping stones across the Adriatic. On the other side, the mountains towering harsh, cut by narrow valleys where rivers ran like silver threads. Between these two worlds, the Illyrians found their rhythm. They were both seafarers and highlanders, salt-breathing fishers, and goat-herding mountaineers. To understand them, you have to stand with one foot in the surf and the other on a jagged ridge and let the wind buffet you from both directions. Along the coast, life revolved around the Adriatic. Imagine harbors carved into coves, simple but ingenious installations with stone-lined anchorages that still leave traces for archaeologists to find. At Issa, on what is today the island of Vis, early Illyrian communities even experimented with what looked suspiciously like primitive lighthouse foundations, rude stone towers with fires lit at the top, flickering signals to guide boats home through treacherous waters. If you've ever tried navigating a rocky coastline with nothing but starlight and hope, you'll understand why the locals thought this was a pretty good idea. The houses of these coastal Illyrians were practical marvels. Built with carefully fitted limestone blocks, their walls could withstand the brutal bora winds that came tearing down from the mountains in icy gusts. The roofs were heavy and slanted, designed to shrug off both rain and wind, while still giving shelter to families who made their living off the sea. Inside, clay hearths glowed the smell of fish stew, mingling with salt air seeping through doorways. Tools for net-making hooks and even navigation aids were common finds, proof that these people weren't just dabbling in fishing, they were serious maritime specialists. Out at sea, Illyrian fishermen cast their nets while shipwrights honed their craft. The Adriatic offered not just food, but freedom. The islands became stepping stones for trade and later perfect bases for piracy. But in these early centuries, the sea was also a lifeline binding scattered communities with strings of shared experience. When we imagine the Illyrians of the coast, we see people with sunburnt skin hands hardened by rope and oar, and eyes always watching the horizon. Now shift the scene inland. The mountains told a different story. In Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Montenegro, Illyrian fortresses rose on high plateaus and ridges, their walls blending into the cliffs themselves. These were the oppida, the fortified settlements that gave safety in a landscape where enemies could appear at any pass. The mountains provided natural defense, and the Illyrians amplified it with stone walls up to 8 meters high. Darsan, one of their most famous fortresses, loomed above its valley like a warning carved into the rock: approach at your peril. Life in the highlands was tough but resourceful. Families herded sheep and goats across steep pastures, their seasonal migrations echoing through the valleys. Some archaeologists suggest transhumance moving flocks from winter valleys to summer highlands was common, and if you've ever watched mountain goats sprinting up a slope that would terrify a human, you can imagine how effective those herds must have been. The highlanders grew grains in terraced fields scraped from stony hillsides with bronze-tipped plows. Water was captured and stored in clever systems carved into bedrock, ensuring that even dry seasons didn't mean disaster. But the mountains also bred warriors. Living on ridges overlooking valleys meant being constantly aware of who might be passing through. Trade routes were opportunity and threat in equal measure. To control them was to control wealth, and so Illyrian highland life was steeped in a culture of defense raiding and resilience. From boyhood, young men learned to navigate treacherous ground, to fight among rocks and trees, to use the landscape itself as a weapon. These were not the broad, open-field battles of the Greeks. They were ambushes, raids, quick strikes from hidden paths. If coastal Illyrians were shipwrights and traders inland, Illyrians were fortress builders and herders. And yet, they were not strangers to one another. Trade stitched the two together, salted fish and shells moving inland wool hides and mountain livestock flowing outward. Amber from the Baltic might travel through the mountains to reach the coast, then cross the sea in Illyrian boats. Ideas too traveled. Pottery styles, burial customs, even religious practices show similarities across these very different landscapes. It's worth pausing here to appreciate how adaptable the Illyrians were. They did not have a single mode of life forced on every community. Instead, they developed two strategies, maritime and mountain, and wove them together. That flexibility is part of what allowed them to endure for centuries, even when larger, more centralized powers pressed against them. Still, there must have been tensions. Picture a coastal fisherman talking to a mountain herder, one used to tides and storms, the other to snow and wolves. Their worlds overlapped, but were not identical. And yet, in graves across the region, the same styles of fibulae, the same jar handles shaped like animal heads appear again and again. Beneath the differences ran a deep current of shared identity. For us today, it's easy to romanticize these contrasts. The sea with its bright sails and salty air, the mountains with their smoke-filled fortresses and defiant warriors. But for the Illyrians, it was just life, sometimes harsh, sometimes rewarding, always balanced between two demanding masters, Neptune's waves and the stony ridges of the Dinaric Alps. And in that balance, we begin to see the Illyrians not as anonymous barbarians in Greek or Roman texts, but as real people, parents raising children under limestone roofs, shepherds chasing stubborn goats up impossible slopes, sailors whispering prayers as their ships slid into fog. Each lived a daily drama in miniature long before history noticed them. If there's one thing the Illyrians were really good at, besides piracy jewelry making and scaring the living daylights out of Greek merchants, it was building fortresses that made would-be invaders think twice. Imagine walking through the dense forests of Bosnia or Montenegro, and suddenly spotting perched high above a valley an enormous wall of stone, as if the mountain itself had decided to grow teeth. That was the Illyrian oppidum part, settlement part, fortress part, declaration to the world, this land is ours. The word oppidum comes from later Roman and Celtic usage, but the concept was already flourishing in Illyrian lands. These hill forts weren't humble little stockades. They were sophisticated complexes, carefully designed and strategically placed. Darsen, one of the most famous examples, sat on a limestone plateau, its massive walls still looming even in ruin. At their tallest, they reached up to 8 meters, built from enormous stone blocks fitted together without mortar, like a Balkan cousin to the mighty walls of Mycenae. Except here, instead of Homeric epics, you'd probably get a group of grim Illyrian warriors staring you down from the battlement spears in hand, daring you to try your luck. These fortresses weren't just brute force. The walls were clever. Gates were arranged in tricky passageways that forced anyone approaching to twist and turn, exposing their vulnerable sides to defenders above. Some gates even funneled attackers into bottlenecks where a handful of Illyrians could hold off a much larger force. It was the Bronze Age equivalent of a home security system, except instead of a motion sensor, you got a spear to the face. Inside the Oppida were more than just military outposts. Archaeologists have uncovered storage rooms, craft workshops, and sometimes central buildings that appear to have been administrative centers. In Darsen, one prominent structure sits on the highest tier, constructed with superior masonry. Was it a palace? A council hall? A proto-town hall, where leaders argued about cattle raids and grain storage? Whatever it was, it spoke of hierarchy planning and a society more complex than the wild tribe's image later Greek writers liked to peddle. The layout often followed terraces carved into hillsides. Lower tiers might house ordinary families in stone or timber dwellings, while the uppermost levels were reserved for elites, warriors, chieftains, maybe even early priestly figures. It created a kind of vertical society with power literally sitting above the rest, and if you think that's symbolic, you're absolutely right. In the ancient world, high ground wasn't just good for defense, it was good for status. Now imagine daily life within these walls. Narrow streets, winding between homes, children running with clay toys, women weaving textiles or grinding grain, smiths hammering bronze in smoky workshops. From the ramparts, guards kept watch, scanning valleys for movement. Was it a caravan, a rival clan, or just a wandering herd of goats? Fires would flicker in hearths, the smell of roasting meat drifting through stone alleys, while beyond the walls, the vast silence of mountain forests pressed in. The psychological effect of the Oppida mattered just as much as their practical use. To neighbors and rivals, they projected strength and permanence. To those inside, they offered a sense of safety in a dangerous world. In an age when raids, cattle theft, and intertribal conflicts were part of the rhythm of life, having walls 8 meters high must have felt like a warm stone blanket, albeit a blanket that could crush you if it toppled. Yet these fortresses also required immense effort to build. Imagine the labor entire communities quarrying stone dragging blocks uphill with ropes and sledges fitting them together under the guidance of master builders. This wasn't a weekend project. It was generational, and it tells us something crucial. Illyrian society was organized enough to mobilize large-scale communal projects. They weren't just scattered clans running around with spears. They were capable of coordinated engineering that required leadership planning and a shared belief that the effort was worth it. And what were they defending? Grain stores, herds, water supplies, yes, but also identity. Each fortress was a physical expression of belonging. This plateau, this valley, this stretch of mountain belongs to us. The walls weren't just stone. They were memory pride and the promise that the community inside would endure. It's tempting to romanticize these sites today, walking among mossy ruins and imagining heroic defenders. But for the Illyrians, they were living, breathing homes. The walls weren't there to look picturesque against the sunset. They were the line between survival and ruin. And when storms blew across the mountains, when rumors of raids traveled through the valleys, the sight of those walls must have steadied Illyrian hearts. So when we think of the Illyrians at this stage in their story, picture not ragged wanderers, but fortress dwellers, masters of high places, stone workers who bent mountains to their will. Their Oppida were fortresses in the sky, reminders that even in a rugged, fragmented landscape, a people could carve out permanent strength and a kind of proto-urban life all their own. If there's one thing archaeologists adore, it's pottery. Pots don't rot away like wood, they don't rust like iron, and they don't vanish into myths like oral traditions. They stubbornly sit in the ground for thousands of years until someone with a trowel, a toothbrush, and an alarming amount of patience digs them up. And when it comes to the Illyrians, the pots speak volumes. They tell us about trade, about ritual, about aesthetics, even about how people saw themselves in relation to the animal world. In short, the secrets of the Illyrians are written not in ink, but in clay. Let's begin with the most striking feature, those handles. Across Illyrian sites, from Slovenia to Albania, archaeologists keep finding large storage jars with handles shaped into stylized animal heads. Some are clearly bulls, with strong snouts and horns. Others look like horses, their manes suggested by quick, artistic flourishes. These jars weren't just for storing grain or oil. They were symbolic, perhaps sacred. Imagine lifting a vessel where the handle is a bull's head. Every time you grip it, you're grasping power, fertility, protection. It was art you could touch, daily art woven into routine life. It's no accident that bulls and horses were chosen. Bulls were tied to strength, virility, and the agricultural cycle. Horses were tied to speed, status, and later warfare. To the Illyrians, these creatures weren't just animals, they were emblems. By embedding them into everyday objects, the Illyrians blurred the line between the practical and the spiritual. You couldn't separate dinner storage from divine symbolism. A grain jar wasn't just a grain jar. It was a little shrine you kept in your pantry. Beyond handles, Illyrian pottery carried geometric designs, spirals, zigzags, and repeating patterns that seem almost hypnotic. Some scholars think these were purely decorative, others argue they carried symbolic meaning cycles of life water, fertility, or cosmic order. Picture an Illyrian woman in 1200 BC, bent over her wheel-carving spirals into wet clay with a steady hand. Was she thinking only of beauty, or was she embedding meaning like writing without words? We may never know, but the consistency across wide regions suggests a shared cultural code, a kind of visual language everyone understood. And it wasn't all storage jars. There were cups for drinking, bowls for communal meals, small vessels likely used in rituals. Some were simple and plain, meant for everyday use. Others were ornate, polished, burnished to a shine that still glimmers under museum lights today. Archaeologists have found miniature vessels as well, tiny, impractical things that make no sense for household chores. These were votive offerings left at sanctuaries or graves. Imagine a grieving family placing a small symbolic cup beside a loved one, a gesture of continuity between the living and the dead. The clay also reveals trade. Some Illyrian pottery incorporates styles borrowed from neighbors, Thracian shapes, here Greek-inspired motifs there. And yet, the Illyrians always made it their own. They weren't passive consumers of outside fashions. They adapted, absorbed, and reimagined. A Greek might recognize the form of a kylix, but the decoration, the spirals, the animal-headed handles would shout Illyrian. This selective borrowing tells us that Illyrian identity was strong enough to resist being swallowed by more dominant cultural trends. They took what they liked and ignored the rest. Now let's consider another angle, the role of pottery in rituals of death. At Glasenac and other burial grounds, archaeologists have found ceramic vessels placed carefully beside bodies. Some contained food or drink for the journey into the afterlife. Others may have symbolized abundance, ensuring the dead would never want. The sheer effort of making, decorating, and then burying such vessels tells us how important they were. Clay was not just functional, it was spiritual currency. Pottery also allows us to peek at Illyrian social structure. Not everyone got the fancy jars. Some graves held plain vessels quickly made utilitarian. Others gleamed with polished ceramics, complex designs, animal-headed handles. This distribution reflects hierarchy, the elite, with access to luxury, and symbolism, common folk with the basics. Clay, it turns out, was a marker of class. And yet, despite those differences, there was unity. From Slovenia to Albania, you can find those same motifs, those same animal heads, those same spirals scratched into the surface. It's a cultural glue, binding together a wide and rugged land. That's how we know the Illyrians weren't just random tribes with no connection. They shared ideas, beliefs, and aesthetics that stretched across mountains and coastlines. Try to imagine an Illyrian household for a moment. In the corner of a smoky room, a jar as tall as your waist sits full of barley, its handles shaped like horse heads, gleaming in firelight. On the table, clay cups each marked with little geometric patterns line up beside bread and cheese. A child toys with a broken fragment, tracing spirals with tiny fingers. Outside in the workshop, someone molds a new vessel, turning clay, smoothing edges, leaving fingerprints that we thousands of years later might still see preserved. It's intimate, human. There's a kind of poetry to it, really. We modern folk leave behind steel, glass, plastic materials that might survive but say little about us as people. The Illyrians left clay, and in that clay, their hands are still visible. Their choices of animals, of patterns of polish, they whisper who they were. what they valued, what they believed. So when we talk about the Illyrians, let's not imagine only warriors on cliffs or pirates at sea. Let's picture also the potters, the women decorating jars with spirals by lamplight, the families storing food in vessels guarded by symbolic bullhead handles. Their culture wasn't just forged in bronze and blood. It was also shaped in clay, humble yet enduring. And in those pots, they left us their most durable secrets. If you want to know what a people believed about life, look at how they treated their dead. The Illyrians, like so many ancient societies, turned their graves into mirrors. They reflected not only grief, but also faith hierarchy beauty, and sometimes a little bit of swagger. And if the pots and fortresses whispered about daily life, the tombs speak in a louder, more solemn voice. This is how we wish to be remembered. Earlier communities in the Balkans had often turned to cremation, reducing the body to ash before placing it in urns or scattering it beneath the soil. The Illyrians, however, shifted toward inhumation, burying the body whole. It's a small detail, but an important one. A body left intact implies a belief in a journey beyond a sense that the dead still needed their physical form in some way. At necropolises like Glazenac in Bosnia, hundreds of stone-lined graves stretch across hillsides, each aligned carefully along a north-south axis. This wasn't random. It was ritual. Even in death, Illyrians liked order. Step into one of these graves with your imagination. Flat stone slabs create the chamber cool and dark. The deceased lies on their back, clothed, adorned, surrounded by objects. A spear at one side, a bronze fibula clasping the cloak, a jar at the feet. To us, they're artifacts. To the Illyrians, they were necessities for the next world. Food for the journey, weapons for protection, jewelry for status. Because why enter the afterlife underdressed and owe the grave goods? The weapons shine with artistry as much as utility. Spearheads with elongated sockets etched with patterns that had no purpose other than to look impressive. Axes adorned with geometric engravings, swords with pommels shaped for both grip and grandeur. Some blades were clearly made to be used. Others were ceremonial, designed less for battle than for symbolism. Each was a statement. This person was important, a warrior, a leader, a protector. The jewelry too speaks volumes. Bronze fibulae brooches, used to fasten cloaks, appear in countless forms, many of them delicately decorated. Some include amber beads, precious imports from the distant Baltic, carried hundreds of miles through trade networks. Others gleam with inlays of gold, a metal rare enough to shout prestige. When archaeologists piece together these treasures, they're not just cataloging objects. They're glimpsing Illyrian society stratified into layers. Ordinary graves contain modest items. Elite graves spill over with wealth, signaling a society where status didn't fade at the edge of mortality, it was paraded into eternity. There's also an emotional thread here. To bury someone with weapons, ornaments, food, and drink is to say we expect you to keep living somewhere else. The afterlife wasn't an abstraction. It was provisioned as if it were just another valley, another journey. A jar of grain, a cup of wine, a favorite dagger. Each told the deceased, take these with you, you'll need them. But funerary practice was also about the living. Burial sites became places of memory, markers of territory, and symbols of continuity. A necropolis wasn't tucked away in some forgotten corner. It was prominent, a landscape statement. Our ancestors are buried here. This is our land. Imagine generations walking past the same rows of graves, each stone reminding them of who they were and who had come before. In this way, death cemented identity just as much as life did. Some graves contained miniature vessels, small cups, or figurines placed as votive offerings. These weren't practical items for the afterlife, but symbolic gestures, tokens of affection, of faith, of ritual obligation. It's easy to picture a family lowering such an item into the grave, whispering prayers, hands trembling between grief and hope. At times, the grave goods hint at stories we can't fully recover. A warrior, buried with not one, but 3 spears, was he known for his skill in battle. A woman laid to rest with an astonishing array of jewelry. Was she a priestess or simply the wife of a chieftain? We can't be sure, but each burial tantalizes us with the promise of a story just out of reach. And then there is the silence. For every richly adorned tomb, there are simpler burials, bodies laid with minimal goods, perhaps nothing more than a plain pot. These remind us that Illyrian society, like our own, had its inequalities. Not everyone could afford gold or amber. Not everyone was remembered with weapons and ornaments. Some passed quietly, their memory carried only in the hearts of kin. Even in death, the line between elite and commoner remained sharp. Still, across these variations, one thing is clear: the Illyrians believed deeply in honoring the dead. They built with stone, buried with care, and marked graves with consistency. They wove the act of remembrance into daily life, and that act, carried out again and again for centuries, gave them resilience as a people. A culture that remembers its dead doesn't vanish easily. It's oddly comforting, isn't it? To think of those stone-lined graves stretching across the Balkans, each one a silent promise that love and duty don't end at the grave. The Illyrians may not have left us poems or scriptures, but they left us something just as powerful: the evidence of memory itself. In their tombs, we see not just death, but the determination to carry identity across the threshold into eternity. Picture the glow of a furnace in the dark. Sparks rise like tiny stars, smoke curls upward, and the rhythmic clang of a hammer echoes against the valley walls. In that glow, we find the Illyrians at one of their most defining crafts: the working of metal. If the stone walls of their fortresses announced their presence to the land, it was their bronze, later their iron, that gave them a sharper voice in the world of war art and trade. Bronze, as the name of the age suggests, was the miracle material of its time. Harder than pure copper, more durable than stone, and let's be honest, much more fashionable than a stick. To make bronze, you needed copper and tin, 2 elements rarely found together in nature. Copper the Illyrians had in abundance, especially in their mountainous interior. Tin, however, was another matter. It had to come from afar, traded through long networks that stretched all the way to Central Europe and beyond. The very presence of bronze weapons and ornaments in Illyrian graves tells us their world was plugged into a wider economic system, one that connected distant mines, merchants, and mountain passes. And what weapons they forged! The Illyrian spearheads were long and elegant, their sockets designed to fit snugly on wooden shafts, some even adorned with engraved patterns. Their axes weren't crude chopping tools, but finely shaped with symmetrical blades and etched designs, geometric lines that carried both beauty and symbolic power. And their swords, shorter than Greek blades, yet sturdy, with distinctive pommels that made them unmistakably Illyrian. When polished, they gleamed like fire in sunlight. Weapons were practical, of course, but they were also badges of honor. To be buried with a bronze sword or spear was to carry one's status into eternity. The decoration on some pieces makes it clear these weren't just tools of war, but objects of pride, craftsmanship, and perhaps ritual. A warrior didn't just wield a sword, he wielded a piece of art that sang of his people's skill. But the Illyrians didn't stop at weapons. Their smiths were equally adept at producing jewelry. Bronze fibulae, The safety pins of the ancient world became canvases for geometric motifs, spirals, and animal shapes. Some incorporated amber beads glowing orange against the green-brown of bronze. Others, for the wealthiest, glittered with delicate gold inlay. A fibula wasn't just a pin to fasten your cloak. It was a miniature work of art, a signal of identity and social position. Think of it as the Illyrian equivalent of a designer label, practical, yes, but also a statement. Amber beads, by the way, are one of the most intriguing finds. They didn't come from the Balkans at all, but from the Baltic hundreds of miles away. To see them in Illyrian graves means caravans of traders carried them south through forests and rivers across dangerous territories until they ended up glinting on an Illyrian cloak. Every amber bead is a testament to how interconnected the ancient world really was. We imagine these societies as isolated, but the truth is, they were part of long-distance exchanges that carried not just goods, but stories and ideas. By around 1000 BC, the Iron Age was sweeping into the Balkans. The Greeks and others had begun experimenting with this tougher, more versatile metal. At first, the Illyrians were late adopters, clinging to bronze perhaps out of tradition, perhaps out of caution. But when they did embrace iron, they moved quickly. Their smiths adapted earlier bronze designs, lengthening swords, sharpening spear points, and creating sturdier agricultural tools. Iron plow tips cut deeper into soil, making farming more efficient. Iron sickles harvested grain faster. And of course, iron weapons held an edge longer than bronze ever could. Still, even as iron rose, bronze did not vanish. It remained the preferred medium for jewelry and ornaments. A bronze fibula, polished to a golden glow, carried a beauty that iron could never match. So, in Illyrian life, the two metals coexisted: iron for war and work, bronze for beauty and ceremony. Fire forged them both, but their roles diverged, reflecting the dual nature of Illyrian society, fierce in battle, elegant in art. Think of an Illyrian smith at work. The forge glows, hot bellows puff as apprentices pump air into the flames. The master, sweat glistening on his brow, pulls a glowing lump of metal from the coals. With practiced strikes, he shapes it on a stone anvil, each clang a note in a song passed down through generations. Sparks leap, the smell of scorched charcoal fills the air, and slowly a spearhead, a fibula, or a dagger emerges from the fire. It is creation, but also transformation. The raw bones of the earth reshaped into symbols of life, death, and power. There's something profoundly human about this. The Illyrians took what lay hidden in mountains, copper veins, scattered tin, later iron ore, and turned it into tools, weapons, and ornaments that defined who they were. Fire and bronze gave them not just technology, but identity. When you see those animal-headed jar handles, those decorated axes, those shimmering fibulae in museums, today you're looking at more than artifacts. You're looking at pride hammered into metal memory, cast in bronze, and the fingerprints of people who lived, loved, fought, and dreamed in a world of fire. The Illyrians lived in a land that was beautiful, yes, but not particularly generous. Fertile plains were rare, and the mountains of the Dinaric Alps were more suited to goats than to golden fields of grain. To survive, they had to coax food out of stubborn soils, carve terraces into hillsides, and follow the rhythms of animals across shifting seasons. Their story is not just one of warriors and pirates. It is also the story of herders, farmers, and communities that learned to turn hard landscapes into homes. Let's start with the coast. Along the Adriatic, land was scarce, but ingenuity was abundant. Illyrian farmers carved terraces into rocky hillsides, leveling small plots where vines, olives, and grains could grow. Terraces not only created space, but helped trap soil and prevent erosion. Rainwater was captured in channels cut into stone, funneled into cisterns carved directly from bedrock. In some places, entire communities worked together to build irrigation systems that collected seasonal rainfall and stored it for the dry months. If you squint, you can almost see them, men and women, hauling stone carving channels and tending vines under a punishing sun while the blue sea shimmered temptingly just beyond. The coast was good for more than wine and olives. The Adriatic yielded fish in abundance, and coastal farmers often doubled as fishermen. Salt production, too, became an important economic activity. With salt, fish could be preserved, and meat could last long into winter. It was the Bronze Age version of refrigeration, and the Illyrians knew how to make the most of it. Move inland, though, and the picture changes. In Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Montenegro, agriculture had to adapt to mountain life. Here herding dominated. Sheep and goats were the lifeblood of highland communities, providing milk, meat, hides, and wool. Archaeologists have even found specialized ceramic vessels for processing dairy products, suggesting that cheese-making was already a well-honed craft. You can imagine an Illyrian shepherd carefully straining curds in a mountain hut, not realizing he was part of a culinary tradition that would last thousands of years. Transhumance seasonal movement of herds was common. In summer, flocks were driven up to high pastures where grass was plentiful. As winter crept in, they were herded back down into valleys where shelter and stored fodder could sustain them. Temporary structures in the archaeological record, stone pens and huts at different elevations, tell us how systematically this seasonal rhythm was practiced. If you picture the Alps today, dotted with herders leading sheep along winding trails, you're not far from what Illyrian life once looked like. Cattle were symbols of wealth, but in the mountains, they also became central to a rite of passage raiding. Young warriors proved themselves by stealing cattle from rivals, a practice that was both economic and cultural. A stolen herd meant food and prestige. It also meant you had shown courage, cunning, and endurance. So the lowing of cattle in an Illyrian valley wasn't just background noise, it was the soundtrack of status, economy, and honor. Grain farming was possible, even in difficult soils. Barley, wheat, and millet were staples. Wooden plows tipped with bronze, or later iron blades cut furrows into stubborn earth. Harvest was done with curved sickles, bronze catching the sun, as villagers moved rhythmically through fields of golden stalks. The image is peaceful, almost pastoral, but behind it lay hard labor risk and constant vigilance against weather pests and hungry neighbors. Food wasn't just survival, it was social glue. Feasts bound communities together, and livestock played starring roles in both meals and rituals. Sacrifices to the gods often included animals, their bones found in hilltop sanctuaries and graves alike. To eat, to share, to offer, these were acts that kept both communities and belief systems alive. The Illyrians also made use of forests, which covered vast areas of their homeland. Hunting supplemented diets with deer boar and smaller game. Timber fueled furnaces for smelting built houses and provided the raw material for ships. But forests were also dangerous places, full of wolves, bears, and lurking enemies. To walk in them was to test one's luck and courage. If we step back and imagine the Illyrian landscape, it hums with life. On the coast, terraces shimmer with green vines, nets stretch to dry in the salty air, and olive presses creak under pressure. In the mountains, herds jangle with bells, shepherds call to one another across valleys, and smoke from dairies curls upward. In the valleys, plows scrape the soil, children chase after chickens, and women pound grain in stone mortars. It's a world where survival is never taken for granted, but where resilience becomes second nature. And there's a kind of poetry in how the Illyrians managed this balance. They weren't blessed with endless fertile plains like the Egyptians or sprawling farmland like the Romans would later command. They had to wrestle with stone-coaxed sustenance from reluctant hillsides and follow animals across unforgiving terrain. In doing so, they became adaptable, creative, and stubbornly self-reliant. So when we think of the Illyrians as warriors or pirates, let's also think of them as herders, calling goats down at dusk, as farmers shaping terraces against the sky, as families gathered around loaves of barley bread and bowls of goat cheese. Their strength on the battlefield was forged not just in training, but in the daily labor of surviving their rugged homeland. Herds, fields, and hillsides were not just background scenery, they were the foundation of Illyrian life. No people lives in complete isolation. Even the Illyrians perched in their mountain fortresses, scattered along their island-studded coasts, could not escape the constant push and pull of neighbors. Some came as traders, bringing new goods and ideas. Others came as raiders or rivals, bringing the sharp end of a spear. And the Illyrians, pragmatic as always, learned to take what they liked, resist what they didn't, and carve out a stubborn cultural identity in a landscape of constant contact. To the north were the Celts, those restless wanderers of Europe who loved nothing more than to migrate, mingle, and sometimes terrify their neighbors. By the time they brushed against Illyrian lands in the first millennium, BC Celtic influence was impossible to ignore. Archaeologists have found Celtic-style metalwork among Illyrian artifacts, spiral decorations, torques, and even certain weapons. Some Illyrian smiths clearly thought, that swirl design looks fancy, and incorporated it into their own jewelry. But adoption wasn't imitation. The Illyrians didn't suddenly become Celts. They blended motifs into their own tradition, like chefs tossing in a spice without changing the entire recipe. Further east, the Thracians loomed. Fierce horsemen, skilled metalworkers, and occasional frenemies, the Thracians shared both borders and habits with the Illyrians. In the upper valleys of the Morava and Vardar rivers, artifacts appear that look half Illyrian, half Thracian pottery, with hybrid styles, weapons that carry the marks of both traditions. Were these products of trade, intermarriage, mixed communities? Probably all of the above. Borders in the ancient Balkans weren't tidy lines on a map. They were wide, messy zones of contact where cultures rubbed elbows and sometimes clashed shields. And then, of course, there were the Greeks. The Greeks, those tireless chroniclers who couldn't resist describing their neighbors as barbarians while secretly buying their goods, borrowing their ships, and sometimes hiring their warriors. Along the Adriatic coast, Greek colonies like Epidamnos, modern Duris, and Apollonia sprang up eager for trade with the Illyrians. The Greeks brought pottery, fine textiles, wine, and luxury items that dazzled Illyrian elites. In return, the Illyrians offered timber metals, livestock, and when negotiations soured piracy. Because why limit yourself to commerce when you could also board a Greek merchant ship and take the cargo by force? It was a love-hate relationship, really. The Greeks admired Illyrian ships, particularly the fast Liburnian vessels, so much that they later copied their designs. At the same time, they wrote plenty of grumpy reports about Illyrian raids and uncivilized behavior. You can almost hear the frustration in their texts. These people refuse to stop stealing our stuff, but their shipwrights are geniuses. That's the Illyrian paradox, both a nuisance and a necessity in the eyes of their southern neighbors. But the exchanges weren't only material. Ideas slipped through too. Greek pottery has been found in Illyrian sanctuaries, sometimes used in rituals alongside local objects. Religious practices may have mingled Greek gods visiting Illyrian hilltops, while Illyrian deities watched over Greek merchants far from home. Yet despite this cultural traffic, Illyrian pottery styles remained distinct. Even in border zones, thick with foreign influence, Illyrian artisans clung to their animal-headed handles and geometric motifs. It was as if they were saying, "We'll take your shiny pottery, thank you, but we'll keep making ours too." The Celts may have introduced new weapon styles. The Thracians may have shared their love of ornate decoration. The Greeks may have offered exotic luxuries. But at the core, Illyrian culture remained intact. That's the striking thing. In a world buzzing with contact, they didn't dissolve into someone else's identity. They absorbed, selectively blending foreign elements into their own traditions while keeping their foundations steady. This balancing act also meant conflict. Raiding was not just an Illyrian pastime, it was a regional sport. Illyrian tribes fought each other as much as they fought outsiders, stealing cattle, clashing in mountain passes, and asserting dominance over trade routes. To the Greeks and Romans, it looked like chaos. To the Illyrians, it was simply life, a rhythm of alliance, rivalry, and revenge. Today's trading partner might be tomorrow's raiding target. Yesterday's enemy might become tomorrow's ally against a more pressing threat. Think of the Illyrians at this point as savvy negotiators in a very tough neighborhood. They didn't have the monumental cities of the Greeks or the sprawling legions of the Romans. What they had were ships that could outmaneuver bigger vessels, fortresses that made mountain passes deadly, and a cultural core that refused to vanish under foreign pressure. They survived by mixing stubborn pride with flexible strategy. So, when we talk about the Illyrians and their neighbors, let's not picture passive tribes overwhelmed by greater civilizations. Let's picture shrewd players at a dangerous table, adopting Celtic spirals, bargaining with Thracian chiefs, trading or raiding Greek merchants, and always remaining themselves. For in that messy blend of trade conflict and cultural borrowing, the Illyrians carved out their distinct place in history. Imagine the Balkans around 1200 or 1000 BC, a patchwork of forests, mountains, rivers, and coasts. To us, it looks like rugged terrain. To the Illyrians, it was the great connective tissue of their world. And although they're remembered by outsiders, mostly for their raids and their fighting, the truth is, the Illyrians were also movers of goods, builders of networks, and savvy participants in what we might call, without too much exaggeration, an early version of globalization. Let's start with the basics, the geography. The Illyrian homeland sat in an enviable position, straddling the Adriatic and the mountain corridors that led inland toward Central Europe. If you wanted to move tin from distant northern mines down to the Mediterranean, you passed through Illyrian valleys. If you wanted timber from Balkan forests to build ships in Greece, you struck deals with Illyrian chieftains. Their lands weren't just rugged, they were strategic. Archaeologists find proof of these networks in the strangest places. Take obsidian, a volcanic glass, prized for cutting edges and ritual value. The Adriatic has no volcanoes yet. Obsidian shows up in Illyrian sites. It must have come from far away, perhaps from the Lipari Islands, north of Sicily. Or consider amber beads from the Baltic discovered in Illyrian graves. Picture that journey from the cold shores of the Baltic, traded hand to hand, community to community, until hundreds of miles later it glittered on the cloak of a warrior buried in the Balkans. Then there were shells, exotic ones, that could only have come from warmer southern waters. They turn up even in remote Illyrian mountain settlements. Someone had carried them inland, along winding routes through passes across rivers. A seashell sitting in a highland grave is not just jewelry, it's evidence of human networks spanning half a continent. But how did these networks actually function? Along the coast, Illyrian ships were the arteries of commerce. Their vessels, fast and light, hugged coastlines, hopped from island to island, and darted across the Adriatic. The Liburni, a maritime Illyrian people, became so famous for their ships that centuries later, the Romans copied their designs. For trade, these vessels carried wine oil and luxury goods from Greek merchants northward, and timber metals, livestock, and hides southward in return. Inland caravans trudged along mountain paths, picture donkeys, or oxen laden with copper ingots shaped like hides, trudging single file through rocky passes. These distinctive oxhide-shaped ingots, heavy and cumbersome, were almost a form of currency, a way to standardize value before coins existed. The Illyrians were middlemen in this trade, part suppliers, part gatekeepers. If you wanted to move goods through their lands, you either paid tolls, made alliances, or risked getting raided. And here lies the paradox. Illyrians were both traders and raiders. To Greek or Roman writers, piracy looked like theft. To Illyrians, it was an economic strategy. One year, you might make a trade agreement with a Greek colony. The next, if the political winds shifted, or a caravan failed to pay tribute, you might raid them instead. It wasn't hypocrisy, it was pragmatism. In a landscape where survival was always precarious, flexibility was key. These networks didn't just move goods, they moved ideas, decorative motifs, spread religious practices, mingled, and even languages picked up new words. A borrowed spiral design on a fibula, a Greek-style vessel repurposed for an Illyrian sanctuary, a Thracian-style weapon found in a coastal grave, all are traces of cultural traffic. The Illyrians weren't just recipients of influence. They were filters and transmitters shaping what passed through their lands. Let's not forget the social side of trade. Imagine the scene, a coastal marketplace near a natural harbor. Fishermen unload baskets of salted catch. Traders arrive from inland with hides and grain. A Greek merchant lays out fine pottery painted with mythic scenes. Local elites stroll through inspecting goods, fingering an amber bead, debating whether the wine is watered down. Deals are struck, alliances whispered gossip, traded as much as goods. The hum of voices, the smell of fish and resin, the clatter of amphorae being rolled into storage. This was Illyrian commerce alive and buzzing. For the ordinary family, trade meant access to items that made life a little brighter. A piece of amber on a necklace, a Greek cup on the household shelf, a sharper iron blade more durable than bronze. Even when imported goods were scarce, their presence mattered. They were symbols, hints of the wider world beyond the mountains, reminders that the Adriatic wasn't a barrier, but a bridge. And yet, beneath all this exchange, lay the Illyrian gift for resilience. They didn't become Greeks just because they used Greek pottery. They didn't become Celts just because they borrowed Celtic spirals. Their identity was like a strong rope, woven from many strands, but firmly their own. The goods that passed through their hands enriched them, but they never let the traffic define them. So when we look at Illyrian trade and travel, we see not just practical economics, but the art of survival in a connected world. They were mountain gatekeepers, coastal sailors, occasional pirates, and reliable middlemen all at once. They understood that to thrive, you needed both walls and ships, both spears and amphorae, both the courage to fight and the wit to bargain. Picture it, caravans creaking through mountain passes, sails snapping on the Adriatic breeze, amber beads glinting in torchlight, oxen pulling copper ingots shaped like stretched animal hides. In every direction, Illyrians were part of something larger, a network stretching across seas and continents. They may not have left us epic poems or marble monuments, but in the quiet persistence of goods moving through their lands, they shaped the flow of the ancient world. Climb with me now, slowly up the ridges of the Dinaric Alps. The path is steep, loose stones rolling beneath your sandals. The air grows thin, sharp, with the scent of pine and wild herbs. As you reach the summit, you find not just a commanding view of valleys and rivers, but something else, a ring of stones blackened by fire, fragments of pottery scattered among them, animal bones cracked from burning. You've arrived at one of the Illyrians' sacred places, a hilltop sanctuary where faith met landscape. The Illyrians did not build towering temples of marble, nor vast ziggurats rising from plains. Their religion was rooted in nature itself. The highest points of the land, the ridges and rocky promontories, became the stages of ritual. From there, the community could look down at the world they claimed as theirs and lift offerings skyward to unseen powers. The gods of the Illyrians were not distant otherworldly figures, at least not entirely. They lived in the wind, the rivers, the forests, and the mountains themselves. Archaeology paints the scene in fragments. At places like Glasenac or Chitluk excavations reveal small altars of stone fire pits filled with ash and offerings of miniature weapons, ceramic vessels, and animal remains. Sacrifices weren't just acts of devotion, they were negotiations. Give us victory, give us fertility, give us safe passage, and in return, here is the best of our herd, the finest of our tools, the token of our faith. Among the most fascinating finds are those miniature weapons. Tiny bronze swords, little spears, delicate shields, all far too small to use in battle. They were symbolic a way of offering the essence of warfare and protection without sacrificing full-scale arms. It's as though Illyrian worshippers were saying, "We know what matters in our world, strength, defense, survival, and we lay it at your feet, O powers above." And then there is the figure of the great goddess. Across Illyrian lands, archaeologists find female figurines carved in stone or cast in bronze. They often wear elaborate headdresses with full breasts and arms raised in ritual posture. These images suggest a goddess of fertility, agriculture, and perhaps protection of the community. Like many ancient societies, the Illyrians seem to have placed a central female divinity at the heart of their spirituality. When crops grew, when flocks multiplied, when children were born strong, it was her blessing that people thanked. But the Illyrians weren't isolated in their beliefs. Contact with Greeks brought new religious practices that began to intermingle with local traditions. Greek pottery appears in sanctuaries used in rituals. Certain Greek gods, especially those tied to the sea or war, may have been honored alongside Illyrian deities. Yet the core sacrifices on hilltops, offerings to the goddess devotion, tied to land and ancestors, remained stubbornly theirs. Religion wasn't confined to mountaintops, of course. Ancestral worship infused daily life. Graves themselves were sacred sites, and family rituals likely involved offerings to the spirits of the dead. To remember your ancestors was to keep them alive, to tie your community to an unbroken chain. Every burial ground was both cemetery and shrine. There's also evidence that sacred sites doubled as symbols of territory. A hilltop sanctuary wasn't just a holy place. It was also a statement: this land is ours, blessed by our gods, guarded by our ancestors. In a world of shifting borders and tribal rivalries, faith and defense blurred together. To climb to a sanctuary and offer sacrifice was as much about identity and belonging as it was about piety. It's easy for us, with our tidy distinctions between religion, politics, and defense, to miss how deeply those categories overlapped in Illyrian life. When warriors gathered on a hilltop to sacrifice before battle, they weren't compartmentalizing. This was one seamless act. To honor the gods was to prepare for war. To feed the ancestors was to claim legitimacy. To burn an offering was to secure both spiritual blessing and communal solidarity. So let's picture one of these ceremonies. A group ascends a mountain path, men in cloaks clasped with bronze fibulae. women carrying jars of wine, children clutching little offerings. At the summit, a fire crackles. A ram or goat is led forward, its fleece gleaming in firelight. The air fills with chanting, the rhythmic sound of drums, or perhaps curved lures, those great bronze horns known from northern Europe, but echoed here too in Balkan finds. The animal is sacrificed, its bones tossed into the flames, its flesh shared in a communal feast. The smoke rises, curling upward, carrying the prayers of a tribe to the unseen powers above. It's intimate and public at once. Intimate because each family brings its offering. Public because the entire community witnesses and shares. Religion wasn't a private affair. It was woven into the fabric of collective identity. And when the ceremony ends, people descend the mountain together. The fire burns. Low pottery fragments are left behind, bones scattered in the ash. Centuries later, archaeologists find these remains and piece together the echoes of faith. But to the Illyrians who walked those paths, it was not fragments, but life itself, the assurance that the gods had heard, that the ancestors were honored, that the land was truly theirs. For centuries, the Illyrians had lived in scattered settlements, fortresses perched on ridges, villages tucked into valleys, fishing hamlets along the coast. Each community had its own rhythm, its own elders, its own identity. But over time, something began to shift. Villages started joining forces. Tribes began to recognize that survival required more than a stout wall or a good herd. Out of this slow transformation emerged the great Illyrian confederations, loose unions of tribes that could command whole regions, coordinate warfare, and even dabble in early statecraft. Why did this happen? Geography played a role. The Balkans are a tough neighborhood. Mountains break up the land, rivers carve deep valleys, and fertile plains are few. Resources were precious. Control of a mountain pass could mean control of trade, and trade meant wealth. But no single village could dominate such wide stretches alone. By banding together, Illyrian communities pooled strength, defended borders, and negotiated with both neighbors and encroaching foreigners. Another reason was pressure. By the end of the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, outside groups, Celts from the north, Thracians from the east, Greeks from the south, were pressing in. For the Illyrians, unity became less of an option and more of a necessity. One hill fort might repel a raid, but only a coalition of hill forts could resist a determined invasion or assert dominance over a larger territory. The result was a patchwork of confederations across the Balkans, each adapted to its environment. Along the rugged Dinaric Alps, the Delmatae grew strong masters of cattle raiding and mountain warfare. Along the sea, the Liburni developed a maritime confederation, their identity tied to fast ships and piracy. In fertile valleys, groups like the Taulantii and Ardii organized around agriculture and river control. Each confederation became a kind of cultural experiment. What happens when a dozen clans decide to work together, sometimes peacefully, sometimes reluctantly, always strategically? Archaeological evidence backs this up. Settlements that once looked isolated begin showing patterns of coordination, shared pottery styles, standardized fortifications, similar burial practices. Coins appear minted not by individuals, but by larger tribal groups. Records hint at councils of warriors and elders' assemblies, where decisions weren't made by one chief alone, but by representatives of multiple clans. It wasn't yet a kingdom, but it was no longer a handful of villages either. Of course, this wasn't a neat transformation. Confederations were messy, like extended families at holiday gatherings. Alliances formed, broke reformed. Leaders rose by skill in war, or the wealth of their herds, but their power was often temporary, tied to the confidence of the tribes they represented. If a war leader failed in battle, he might find his coalition dissolving faster than snow in spring. Authority in Illyrian confederations was real, but fluid, stronger than a village council, weaker than a monarchy. Yet this messiness was also resilience. A confederation could survive the death of a leader because no single figure held absolute power. It could expand or contract as needed, pulling in allies or cutting off troublesome members. It was flexible in a way that monarchies often were not. That flexibility would serve the Illyrians well when foreign powers like Macedon or Rome began knocking on their door. For the Illyrians themselves, these confederations changed daily life. A young warrior might now be called not only to defend his own village, but to raid on behalf of the wider confederation. Trade routes that once served a single valley now fell under the protection or exploitation of a larger group. Political assemblies might bring together men from dozens of communities, creating shared laws, customs, and strategies. Slowly, an Illyrian identity began to stretch beyond the local, beyond the village, beyond even the tribe. But these alliances weren't just about war. Confederations coordinated economic life too. In some regions, irrigation projects demanded collective labor. Granaries were built to hold not just one village's harvest, but the surplus of several. Along the coast, fleets needed coordination, who contributed ships, who led raids, how spoils were divided. These weren't small questions. The answers shaped the very structure of Illyrian society. Still, let's not imagine neat bureaucracies with stamped documents and tidy records. These were oral societies where memory and reputation carried weight. Agreements were sealed not with paperwork, but with oaths, feasts, and sometimes marriages. A raid gone well cemented loyalty. A failed expedition frayed bonds. Yet through it all, the pattern held. Illyrian communities learned to think bigger, to see themselves as parts of something larger than a single hilltop fortress. By the dawn of the first millennium, BC, the Illyrians had laid the foundation for a new phase in their history. Confederations gave them the strength to project power, to raid farther, to trade wider, and eventually to birth kings and queens whose names would echo in Greek and Roman texts. But that is a story for later. For now, picture the Illyrians in this in-between stage, villagers still tied to hearth and field, yet also members of something larger, something growing. A confederation, not quite a nation, not quite an empire, but the first step toward both. If the Illyrians were a tapestry, woven from many threads, then the Delmatae were the rough mountain-stitched strand that gave the whole fabric its toughness. These were not the seafaring Liburni, with their swift ships and salt in their hair. These were highland warriors, born and raised in the unforgiving heart of the Dinaric Alps, where stone snow and stubborn goats outnumbered fertile fields 10-1. And in that harsh landscape, the Delmatae built a culture of resilience, ferocity, and let's be honest, quite a bit of raiding. Their very name survives in echoes, Dalmatia, the region along the Adriatic coast, that still carries their memory, even if modern visitors are more likely to think of beaches and spotted dogs than of mountain warriors. But in antiquity, to hear of the Delmatae was to think of raids, cattle theft, and warriors who thrived in the kind of terrain that made outsiders shiver. The Delmatae were masters of cattle raiding. To us, that might sound quaint, like some rustic inconvenience. But in their world, cattle meant wealth, survival, and prestige. A herd was food, clothing, leather, and currency all in one. To steal a rival's herd wasn't just theft. It was an economic coup and a public humiliation. For young Delmatae warriors, the cattle raid was a rite of passage. To sneak across enemy valleys at night to drive lowing beasts back through hidden passes to return home triumphant, this was the test of manhood. Success brought status. Failure meant ridicule or death. It was dangerous, yes, but also deeply thrilling. Think of it as their version of extreme sports, except with more spears. Training began early. Boys were raised in the mountains, their lungs filled with thin air, their muscles hardened by climbing, hauling, and herding. They learned to move silently over rocky ground, to use the land as both shield and weapon. They practiced with curved swords, distinctive to the Delmatae, short enough for close combat in rocky terrain, yet deadly in skilled hands. Endurance was their trademark. A Delmatae warrior could march for hours with full gear-scale ridges that would leave outsiders gasping and still have the strength to fight at the summit. Their settlements reflected their character. Strongholds like Delminium, perched in the mountains, were fortified with terrace walls and narrow gates. From above, they commanded views of valleys and passes, watching every movement of herds and caravans below. Within the walls, life was Spartan but purposeful. Council houses, training grounds, storage pits for grain, all carved into the hillside in tiers. Archaeological finds even hint at rudimentary record-keeping clay tablets scratched with marks that may have tracked resources or herds. For a people often dismissed by outsiders as barbarian, the Delmatae were surprisingly organized. Politically, they relied on assemblies of warriors and councils of elders. Leadership wasn't hereditary monarchy. It was earned through prowess. A proven warrior might be chosen as war leader for a campaign, but his authority was temporary. Once the raid was over, he stepped back into the ranks. In peacetime, elders advised guiding the tribe with the weight of memory. It was a system both flexible and deeply tied to martial culture. To rule the Delmatae, you had to prove yourself with spear and sword. Their reputation grew, and not just locally. Greek and Roman writers, always eager to categorize neighbors, described the Delmatae as restless, fierce, and particularly troublesome. Rome in particular would come to know them well and not fondly. Their raids spilled across borders. Their resistance to control was legendary, and it often took multiple Roman campaigns to pacify them. Even then, pacification was temporary. The mountains, after all, were as stubborn as the people who lived in them. But beyond the fighting, the Delmatae had their own cultural richness. Their burials reveal warriors adorned with weapons and ornaments, women with jewelry of bronze and amber. They participated in the broader Illyrian artistic tradition, with decorated fibulae and symbolic vessels. Their hilltop sanctuaries show traces of animal sacrifice offerings to gods of war, fertility, and protection. Like all Illyrians, they tied faith to land tribe and ancestors, blending spirituality with survival. Still, the heart of their identity lay in their warrior ethos. Outsiders might sneer and call them bandits, but within their own world, they were celebrated as protectors, providers, and champions. To be Delmatae was to live on the edge between hunger and plenty, between peace and raid, between survival and glory. So the next time you think of Dalmatia, with its shimmering coastlines and lazy summer beaches, remember its ancestors, young men slipping through mountain passes in the moonlight, cattle hooves echoing in the dark, warriors with curved swords strapped to their sides, and a society that thrived on the razor's edge of risk. They were the mountain raiders, the Delmatae Illyrian, to the core, fierce and unyielding, their memory carved into the very land that still bears their name. If the Delmatae were lords of the mountains, then the Liburni were masters of the waves. Their home was the jagged coastline of northern Dalmatia, a world of countless islands, coves, and hidden channels. To outsiders, it looked like a maze. To the Liburni, it was a highway, one they knew better than anyone else. And in that labyrinth of sea and stone, they built a reputation that would echo across the Mediterranean: fearless sailors, cunning traders, and depending on who you ask, the most infuriating pirates of antiquity. The Liburni didn't just dabble in seafaring. They lived and breathed it. Archaeology and ancient accounts alike point to their remarkable ships, the Liburnian vessels. These were long, narrow galleys, with shallow drafts that let them skim close to shore, slip between islands, and even dart into rivers. They were fast maneuverable and terrifyingly efficient. To a lumbering Greek merchant ship, a Liburnian galley must have seemed like a wolf among sheep, hence the nickname later given to them, the Sea Wolves. And yes, centuries later, the Romans themselves would copy the design, recognizing that in the hands of a skilled crew, these ships were the naval equivalent of a sports car. The Liburni organized their society much like they organized their fleets, through clans bound together by maritime law and mutual necessity. Each clan controlled certain islands or stretches of coast, and each jealously guarded its fishing grounds and anchorages. But they also came together in larger assemblies. Sources tell us that they met on the island of Charicta, modern Kirk, where clan leaders debated settled disputes and coordinated naval operations. Imagine that an annual maritime parliament with elders and captains gathered by the sea, deciding whether to trade peacefully launch raids or elect fleet commanders for expeditions. And raids there were. Greek and later Roman writers complained endlessly about Liburnian piracy. Merchant ships laden with wine olive oil or luxury goods were irresistible prizes. The Liburni didn't merely attack at random. They had intelligence networks, scouts posted on islands, lookouts disguised as fishermen. They studied trade routes, seasons, and winds. When the time was right, their ships slipped silently from hidden coves, struck with precision, and vanished into channels where no heavier vessel could follow. To Greek merchants, it was maddening. To the Liburni, it was simply good business. But piracy wasn't the whole story. The Liburni were traders too. Their harbors buzzed with exchanges of fish, salt, timber, livestock, and imported goods. Salt, in particular, became a cornerstone of their economy. By evaporating seawater in shallow pans, they produced the white gold of antiquity used to preserve fish and meat. That product, in turn, fueled more trade, more connections, more wealth. Still, it was their ships that defined them. A Liburnian galley carried perhaps 50 to 80 rowers' men, who could also double as warriors. Each vessel was equipped not just with oars, but with a bronze-sheathed ram for smashing enemy hulls, grappling hooks for boarding, and warriors armed with javelins, short swords, and shields. Imagine a sudden ambush at sea, the slap of oars in rhythm, the shouts of warriors as they clamber aboard the chaos of merchants desperately defending their cargo. To be caught by the Liburni was to learn why wolves were feared. Their reputation spread so widely that when Rome eventually built its navy for Mediterranean dominance, it adopted Liburnian designs. The sleek Liburna became a standard Roman warship type used for patrol scouting and quick strikes. In other words, the pirate's playbook became the empire's doctrine. Talk about leaving a legacy. Within Liburnian society, seafaring shaped everything. Families measured wealth not just in cattle or grain, but in ships and rights to anchorages. Young men grew up learning to row, to tie knots, to read winds and tides. Festivals were tied to the sea rituals performed at harbors gods invoked to bless voyages. It's likely that their deities were as much spirits of waves and storms as of fields and mountains. And of course, there was prestige. A successful raid didn't just bring loot, it brought glory. Returning ships must have been welcomed with feasts, spoils divided carefully according to clan custom. Leaders gained power, not from hoarding all the wealth, but from distributing it wisely, ensuring every participant felt rewarded. In this way, piracy and trade weren't anarchic chaos. They were structured, rule-bound, and integrated into social life. If the Delmatae represented the grit of Illyrian mountains, the Liburni embodied the cunning of the sea. To their enemies, they were predators. To themselves, they were protectors of their waters, guardians of their clans, and proud sailors whose skill was unmatched. So picture it, the sun sinking over the Adriatic, turning the water crimson. Out of a shadowy cove, sleek Liburnian galleys slide into view, oars dipping in perfect rhythm. On deck, warriors ready their javelins, eyes fixed on the silhouette of a fat merchant ship against the horizon. A cry goes up, the pace quickens, and the chase is on. This was the life of the sea wolves of Illyria, swift, dangerous, and unforgettable. If the Delmatae were hardened by their mountains and the Liburni sharpened by their seas, then the Taulantii and the Ardii were nurtured by fertile valleys and river plains. Their world was not all jagged ridges or pirate coves, but broad stretches of arable land, watered by rivers and kissed by the Adriatic sun. Here, instead of relying primarily on raiding or seafaring Illyrian life tilted toward agriculture. These were the grain kings of Illyria tribes whose power and prestige grew out of the soil itself. The Taulantii settled in what is now central Albania, stretching over river valleys that fed into the coast. The Ardii held sway further north, their capital eventually rising at Skadra, modern Shkodër, where rivers converged in a strategic embrace of mountains and plains. Together, these confederations controlled some of the most fertile land in all of Illyrian territory, land that could sustain larger populations, generate surpluses, and support more complex forms of political organization. Agriculture here was not subsistence-level scraping, but planned communal labor. Excavations reveal granaries with sophisticated ventilation systems designed to keep grain dry and prevent rot. These weren't little bins for a family's winter supply. They were massive storage facilities serving whole communities. Control of these granaries meant control of food, and control of food meant power. In times of plenty, leaders could reward loyalty. In times of scarcity, they could demand obedience. Grain was currency, and whoever held the keys to the granary doors effectively ruled. To manage such systems, the Taulantii and Ardii developed governance beyond the village council. Representatives from districts came together to coordinate planting schedules, harvest times, and the distribution of surpluses. This was not glamorous work. No epic songs were sung about deciding how to apportion barley, but it was the bedrock of power. Warriors might win glory, but administrators ensured survival. That said, the grain kings were no strangers to war. The Taulantii and Ardii raised warrior aristocracies like their kin in the mountains, but their fighting style reflected their environment. Instead of goat path ambushes or lightning raids at sea, they specialized in river warfare and amphibious tactics. The rivers of their territories weren't just highways for trade. They were also battlefields. Excavations at Ardii sites reveal long spears designed for thrusting from boats and shields with reinforced rims that allowed for maneuvering in tight, unstable spaces. Imagine warriors crouched in narrow boats, paddling silently downriver before launching a surprise strike against a rival village. It was combat woven into water. The Ardii, in particular, grew into one of the most prominent Illyrian powers. By the 5th and 4th centuries BC, their territory stretched widely, and their leaders began to rise to the level of kingship. Skadra, their capital, became more than a fortified town. It was a hub of administration, trade, and eventually diplomacy. From this base, Ardii kings would later negotiate with Greeks, Macedonians, and eventually Romans. Grain, as humble as it sounds, gave them leverage. You can't run an army or a city without food. and the Ardii had it in abundance. The Taulantii, for their part, leaned heavily into their agricultural wealth. Greek sources mention them in connection with vineyards, and it's tempting to picture their valleys producing early Balkan wines. Whether or not their vintage was export-worthy, it symbolized a community rooted in the land, drawing strength from crops as much as cattle or loot. They became known not for piracy or raiding, but for feeding their people and supplying neighbors. Religion in these fertile regions naturally tied itself to cycles of growth and harvest. Figurines of female deities found here suggest strong fertility cults, possibly linked to the great goddess worship seen across Illyrian lands. Agricultural festivals likely accompanied planting and harvest rituals, blending prayer with practical hope, rain at the right time, sun without drought, protection from pests. Sacrifices of livestock at hilltop sanctuaries might ensure good crops in the valleys below. To the Taulantii and Ardii, the divine was never far from the soil. But let's not paint too rosy a picture. Fertile land was both blessing and curse. Where there was abundance, there was also envy. Neighboring confederations often cast hungry eyes on the plains leading to conflict. The grain kings defended their wealth fiercely, and their control of rivers meant they could choke off trade or movement at will. In a world where geography was destiny, the Taulantii and Ardii had drawn a fortunate lot, but fortune always attracted trouble. So what did daily life look like under these confederations? Picture broad fields, dotted with workers guiding oxen-drawn plows tipped with bronze or iron. Children gather sheaves, while women grind grain in stone querns, the steady hum of labor mixing with birdsong. In the distance, granaries rise their walls, thick, their interiors cool and dry. Beside the riverboats, slide through water, carrying grain to neighboring settlements or warriors to patrol against raiders. At night, the scent of baking bread drifts across villages, and families sit together over simple meals that collectively sustain entire tribes. The Taulantii and Ardii remind us that Illyrian power didn't rest solely on spears and ships. Sometimes it sprouted from seeds ripened in the sun and was stored in stone granaries. Their wealth lay not only in cattle or loot, but in the humble grains that fed their people and armies. They were the grain kings of Illyria, guardians of abundance, in a land better known for ruggedness, proving that in the ancient world, control of the harvest was just as mighty as control of the sword. War for the Illyrians wasn't some occasional emergency. It was woven into the fabric of life. From cattle raids in mountain valleys to ambushes in shadowed forests, from swift naval strikes on the Adriatic to pitched battles against Macedonians or Romans, the Illyrian way of war was as varied as their landscapes. To understand them, we need to set aside the marble-armored legions of Rome or the phalanxes of Greece, and instead picture something more fluid, more adaptable, and perhaps more unsettling, a culture where every young man was expected to fight, and where honor, survival, and community all turned on the edge of a blade. At its core, Illyrian warfare was raiding. In the mountains, this meant stealing cattle, harassing rivals, and asserting dominance through daring strikes. In the coastal regions, it meant piracy, swift attacks on merchant ships, lightning-fast retreats into coves. To Greek and Roman observers, this seemed chaotic, even criminal. But to the Illyrians, it was structured, almost ritualized. A raid wasn't just theft. It was a recognized way of redistributing wealth, testing bravery, and maintaining the balance of power between tribes. And make no mistake, bravery was the currency of Illyrian aristocracy. To become a respected man, you had to prove yourself in war. This wasn't optional. Boys grew up watching elders return from raids with spoils and stories. The message was clear. Courage in combat was the ladder to status. Young warriors trained relentlessly practicing ambush tactics in forests, learning to throw javelins with deadly accuracy and hardening themselves by long marches through brutal terrain. A youth who returned from his first raid with captured cattle, or better yet with enemy weapons, came back not only richer, but transformed his place in society confirmed. The aristocratic codes that governed these raids were surprisingly complex. Spoils were divided according to strict rules, a share for each warrior, a larger share for leaders, and sometimes a portion dedicated to religious offerings. Failure to respect these divisions could fracture alliances, so leaders had to tread carefully. A good war chief wasn't just a skilled fighter. He was a skilled distributor, ensuring everyone felt rewarded and bound to him. Leadership in Illyria was measured as much in generosity as in blood spilled. Weapons reflected this culture. The curved short sword, sometimes likened to a sickle in shape, was a favorite for close combat. Spears, both for throwing and thrusting, dominated the battlefield. Shields varied by tribe, but round wooden bronze boss types appear in graves, often decorated with geometric motifs. Armor was less common. Illyrian warriors valued speed and agility over heavy protection. Helmets, however, were sometimes worn simple bronze caps, occasionally with decorative crests, symbols as much of prestige as of defense. Picture a warrior leaping over rocks, light on his feet, curved sword, flashing in one hand, a small shield in the other. That was the Illyrian style, fast, ferocious, and frighteningly effective in the right terrain. The land itself was their greatest ally. Illyrian fighters knew every ridge, every pass, every thicket where an ambush could be staged. Outsiders marching through their mountains often found themselves harassed by unseen attackers, arrows and javelins raining down from cliffs, sudden charges scattering their ranks. Even when outnumbered, Illyrians could devastate an enemy by using the landscape as weapon. The Romans, used to open field battles, struggled mightily against this kind of guerrilla warfare, often taking years to subdue just one confederation. At sea, the Illyrian way of war was equally distinctive. The Liburnian ships, fast and narrow, excelled at ambush. Crews combined rowing and fighting warriors, doubling as oarsmen. A raid might involve creeping along a coastline at night, striking at dawn, and vanishing before a counterattack could form. Boarding was the favored tactic. Grappling hooks flung warriors leaping across decks, chaos breaking out as cargo became plunder and merchant crews became captives. Again, to outsiders, this looked like piracy. To the Illyrians, it was a legitimate expression of power. But war wasn't just about raiding. Larger campaigns required larger organization. By the 5th and 4th centuries BC, some Illyrian confederations fielded armies numbering in the tens of thousands. Kings like Bardylus later commanded forces disciplined enough to challenge Macedonia itself. Yet even these armies retained Illyrian characteristics: flexible tactics, emphasis on mobility, and an aristocratic warrior elite at the core. Where Macedonians fought shoulder to shoulder in rigid phalanxes, Illyrians preferred looser formations able to adapt quickly to rough ground. The Illyrian way of war also carried a psychological edge. Their sudden raids and ferocious charges earned them a reputation for savagery, one that Greek and Roman authors exaggerated gleefully. Tales of Illyrian warriors painted them as fierce, barbaric, almost unstoppable when unleashed. This was propaganda, of course, but it also reveals how effective they were at projecting fear. In a world where morale could decide battles as much as numbers, fear was a weapon in its own right. And yet within their own culture, this ferocity was balanced by rules. Raiding had codes. Spoils were shared. Alliances were negotiated. Even the fiercest warrior was bound by community expectations. It wasn't mindless violence, it was structured aggression, the lifeblood of a society that measured worth in courage and cunning. So if you want to picture the Illyrian way of war, don't imagine neat formations or shining bronze ranks. Imagine instead a moonlit cattle raid hooves, pounding, as warriors drive herds through a mountain pass. Imagine a merchant ship suddenly surrounded by sleek galleys, the air filled with shouts and splintering wood. Imagine a Roman column climbing a ridge only to be ambushed from above, panic breaking their lines as Illyrian warriors vanish back into the rocks. This was war, as the Illyrians knew it, unpredictable mobile rooted in courage and cunning. For them, it wasn't just survival, it was identity. To fight bravely was to live honorably. To raid successfully was to provide for your people. To share the spoils was to lead wisely. The Illyrian way of war was not just about killing enemies, it was about defining who they were, tribe by tribe, confederation by confederation, a people forever sharpened by the edge of conflict. The Greeks and the Illyrians lived close enough that avoiding each other would have been impossible, even if both had wanted to. And truth be told, neither really wanted to. The Greeks needed timber metals, hides, and hardy warriors. The Illyrians, in turn, coveted Greek pottery, fine textiles, wine, and the occasional chance to board an unsuspecting Greek merchant ship and help themselves. It was, shall we say, a complicated relationship, equal parts trade and tension, diplomacy and daggers. On the southern Adriatic coast, Greek colonists founded settlements like Epidamnos, modern Duris, and Apollonia. To Greek eyes, these were shining outposts of civilization, gateways to the wild interior. To the Illyrians, they were convenient marketplaces that sometimes needed to be reminded who really controlled the surrounding land. Colonies brought trade, but they also brought friction. An Illyrian clan might happily supply timber to Greek shipbuilders one season, then raid the same colony's caravans the next, if they felt shortchanged. The Greeks, of course, wrote about all this in their usual exasperated tone. Illyrians appear in Greek texts as troublesome barbarians, fierce fighters, and persistent pirates. But behind the insults lies a grudging respect. Greek merchants kept coming back after all, and Greek colonists learned quickly that peaceful relations with local tribes were essential for survival. Archaeological finds proved that trade thrived. Greek amphorae for wine and oil, black figure and red figure pottery, even delicate glassware turn up in Illyrian sanctuaries and graves. Imagine a warrior's tomb, furnished with not only his curved sword and bronze fibula, but also a fine imported cup, painted with a scene of Dionysus and satyrs. It wasn't just a vessel, it was a statement: I can afford Greek luxury, and I'm still Illyrian enough to bury it with me. But the traffic wasn't all one way. Greek colonists borrowed too. They adopted the Liburnian ship design, recognizing its speed and maneuverability. They relied on Illyrian guides and traders to move goods inland. Some Greek communities even hired Illyrian mercenaries, valuing their ferocity in war. You can almost hear the irony. Yes, they raid our ships constantly, but have you seen how good they are with a spear? Let's hire them. This uneasy dance between cooperation and conflict played out in countless little dramas. A Greek trader unloading amphorae at a coastal market might haggle with Illyrian chiefs under watchful eyes, wondering whether today's negotiation would end with a handshake or a raid. Colonists at Apollonia might sip wine from imported cups while nervously glancing inland, knowing that a Delmatae raid could appear at any time. And Illyrian chieftains, for their part, must have relished the double game, selling cattle and timber, one week seizing a cargo of Greek textiles the next. Religion, too, became a zone of mingling. Greek pottery and figurines show up in Illyrian sanctuaries, suggesting that colonists and locals sometimes shared ritual spaces. Perhaps an Illyrian offering to the great goddess sat beside a Greek libation to Athena. The gods may not have minded the overlap. After all, both peoples lived under the same sky, farmed the same soil, and feared the same seas. And yet cultural borrowing never erased Illyrian identity. While Greek vases appeared in Illyrian graves, Illyrian pottery, with animal-headed handles, never disappeared. While Greek gods may have whispered their way into rituals, Illyrian sanctuaries kept burning with local practices. It was a selective adoption, the kind of pragmatic blending that says, "We'll take your fancy cup, but we'll drink our own wine in it, thank you very much." But trade and mingling didn't erase tension. Greek colonists often saw themselves as civilizers on a mission bringing order to a rough land. The Illyrians, unsurprisingly, didn't share that view. To them, the Greeks were outsiders squatting on their shores, useful when they paid tribute, irritating when they forgot who really commanded the hills above. Raids on colonies were as much about asserting dominance as about seizing goods. This friction escalated at times into open conflict. Greek colonies sought help from their homeland or from powerful neighbors when Illyrian pressure grew too strong. Illyrian confederations, emboldened by wealth and numbers, occasionally besieged colonies or disrupted their hinterlands. These weren't world-ending wars, but they left scars in the memory of both sides. Still, for all the mutual suspicion, the relationship endured. The Greeks never abandoned their Adriatic footholds, and the Illyrians never ceased trading with them. It was a relationship of necessity, like two bickering neighbors who can't stand each other but still borrow sugar across the fence. Out of that tension came a cultural exchange that shaped both peoples, even if neither would have admitted it at the time. So when we think of Greeks and Illyrians, let's not imagine only raiding and insults. Let's imagine crowded harbors, where Greek merchants bargain under the suspicious gaze of Illyrian chiefs. Let's picture sanctuaries where foreign and local offerings burn side by side. Let's hear the clatter of amphorae unloading at dawn, and just offshore the creak of Liburnian ships lying in wait. It was never simple friendship, never pure hostility, always something in between. A dance of friction trade and begrudging respect that kept both peoples entangled for centuries. By the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the Illyrians were no longer just a scattering of tribes and confederations raiding neighbors and trading across mountain passes. Something new was stirring ambition on a grander scale. For the first time, Illyrians began to move toward centralized authority, toward kingship. At the heart of this transformation stood one remarkable figure, Bardylus, a man who took the loose, brawling energy of tribal Illyria and hammered it into something formidable enough to challenge even Macedonia itself. Bardylus's early life is cloaked in mystery, as so much of Illyrian history is. Some later sources suggest he began humbly, even as a miner or smith, which, if true, makes his rise all the more striking. From ore and fire to throne and crown, if that story is accurate, Bardylus was the very image of Illyrian grit. What we do know is that by around 385 BC, he had become the undisputed leader of a large coalition of tribes centered on the powerful Dardani. Through skill, charisma, and a sharp sword, he transformed this coalition into what many historians call the first true Illyrian kingdom. Under Bardylus, Illyrian armies became not just raiders, but disciplined forces. He recruited widely, drawing from various tribes, and seems to have instituted a degree of training and organization that earlier Illyrian warbands lacked. His warriors were still fierce, still fast-moving and mobile, but now they marched with cohesion. Numbers in ancient texts can be exaggerated, but reports suggest Bardylus could field tens of thousands of men. That was no small feat in a land of rugged hills and scattered settlements. And Bardylus didn't waste his new power. He turned it south toward Macedonia. At this time, Macedonia was not yet the powerhouse it would become under Philip II and Alexander. It was fractured, plagued by dynastic squabbles, vulnerable to pressure from its northern neighbors. Bardylus exploited this weakness with ruthless efficiency. In 385 BC, he inflicted a devastating defeat on the Macedonians, killing their king Amyntas II. and seizing large swaths of territory. For a generation, the Macedonians paid tribute to the Illyrians, an astonishing reversal of the roles we usually imagine. The barbarians had become overlords, and the Greeks to the south could only look on in alarm. For 40 years, Bardylus ruled, and under his hand, Illyria reached an unprecedented level of power. He wasn't just a warlord. He was a monarch in the making. Evidence suggests he minted coinage, a clear sign of administrative centralization. Some of these coins bore geometric motifs and symbols of power, a visual language that announced Illyrian authority to friend and foe alike. His capital at Skadra, modern Shkodër, grew into a political and military hub, fortified and bustling with activity. Trade flourished under his control, with caravans moving safely through lands that had once been fractured by endless raiding. Yet Bardylus's reign was not merely a story of military dominance. It was also about legitimacy. He seems to have elevated the role of the Illyrian aristocracy, binding them to his kingship with wealth spoils and honors. In return, they offered loyalty and manpower. Religion, too, likely played its part. Sacrifices at sanctuaries, offerings to ancestors, perhaps even new rituals tied to kingship, all helped frame Bardylus, not as just another strongman, but as a ruler, favored by the gods. For a people who prized freedom and clan loyalty, this shift towards centralized monarchy required more than force. It required persuasion and shared belief. Still, Bardylus was a warrior to the end. In 358 BC, at the age of about 90, an almost mythical number in the ancient world, he faced off against Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. The Illyrian army, reportedly 10,000 strong, clashed with Philip's reorganized phalanx. It was a brutal battle, and this time the Illyrians fell. Bardylus himself was slain, and Macedonia, newly revitalized under Philip, began its rise to dominance. Yet even in defeat, Bardylus's legacy endured. He had proven that the Illyrians could stand toe-to-toe with great powers, that they could organize beyond tribes, that they could imagine kingship. After Bardylus, Illyrian kingship did not vanish. His successors, including his son Clitus, and later rulers like Agron and Teuta, continued the tradition. The model had been set. Illyrian confederations could become kingdoms, led by monarchs, who commanded not just warriors, but administrators, traders, and priests. Bardylus had cracked open the door to Illyria's royal age. Picture him then, in his final years, an old man hardened by decades of war, seated in Skadra's stronghold. Bronze armor, polished advisors gathered at his side. Outside, warriors sharpen spears. Merchants load caravans, and emissaries from Macedonia and Greece wait nervously for audience. The fire of his youth may have dimmed, but the kingdom he built glows fiercely still. Bardylus Smith, turned king raider, turned monarch, was the man who showed the Illyrians what they could become. The rise of Bardylus had transformed the Illyrians from loose confederations into a kingdom feared by its neighbors. But no kingdom lasts unchallenged, and to the south, Macedonia was stirring. The clash between Illyrians and Macedonians would shape not only the fate of both peoples, but also the balance of power in the Balkans for generations. It was a collision of two emerging powers, each determined to dominate, each unwilling to bow. When Bardylus first flexed his muscles against Macedonia in the early 4th century BC, the Macedonian throne was weak, shaken by dynastic disputes and external threats. Bardylus took full advantage, defeating their armies and forcing them to pay tribute. For nearly a generation, Illyrian warriors swaggered through northern Macedonia, their raids leaving smoldering villages, and their influence heavy on the throne. Greek observers were shocked Macedon, that northern kingdom they had once sneered at as half-barbarian, was now itself under the heel of barbarians even further north. It was as if the world had turned upside down. But the tide began to shift, with the rise of Philip II, one of history's most brilliant military reformers. In 359 BC, Philip inherited a Macedonia on the brink of collapse. Within a year, he restructured the army into the famous Macedonian phalanx, drilled his men into professional soldiers, and set his sights on reversing Illyrian dominance. For Philip, Illyria was not just a neighbor. It was a threat to Macedon's very survival. In 358 BC, the confrontation came. Bardylus, by then, a staggering 90 years old, still led his warriors in person, a detail so astonishing that even ancient sources pause to marvel at it. With an army of perhaps 10,000 Illyrians, he faced Philip's reorganized force near Lake Lychnidus, modern Lake Ohrid. What followed was a battle that would decide the balance of power in the northern Balkans. The Illyrians fought in their traditional style, flexible formations, swift charges, fierce individual combat. But Philip's phalanx was something new, tight disciplined, bristling with Sarissa's long pikes that created a hedge of death. As the two forces clashed, the Illyrians, brave as ever found themselves, ground down by relentless coordination. Bardylus's men charged again and again, but the Macedonian lines held. Eventually, the Illyrians were overwhelmed. Ancient accounts claim 7,000 Illyrians were slain, and Bardylus himself fell in the fighting. With that, Illyrian supremacy over Macedonia ended. Yet the Illyrians did not vanish. Philip had to fight them repeatedly, and his son, Alexander the Great, would also face them in his early campaigns. In 335 BC, when Alexander had just taken the throne, Illyrian tribes led by Clitus Bardylus's son rose in rebellion. They allied with neighboring tribes, hoping to crush the young king before he found his footing. Alexander marched north with speed that stunned his foes. At the Battle of Pelium, he encircled Clitus's forces, cutting them off and forcing a desperate fight. Once again, Illyrian courage met Macedonian innovation, and once again, the phalanx combined with Alexander's daring tactics prevailed. The Illyrians broke scattering into the mountains. Alexander, still in his teens, had proven himself, and the Illyrians had learned that a new conqueror was on the stage. But here's the twist. Alexander didn't just defeat them. He recruited them. Illyrian warriors respected for their ferocity became part of his army. They marched with him into Greece, Asia Minor, and beyond. Imagine Illyrian fighters, once raiders of Macedonian valleys, now standing in the sands of Persia, staring at palaces and deserts beyond anything they had ever dreamed of. From mountain passes to Babylon, what a journey. This dual relationship, sometimes enemies, sometimes allies, would characterize Illyrian-Macedonian interaction for decades. Macedon, for all its power, could never fully subdue the wild tribes of the north. Illyrian resistance simmered, flaring up when opportunity came, yielding when pressure mounted. Macedon might win battles, but the Illyrian spirit proved harder to crush. And beyond the battlefield, these clashes reshaped the map of the Balkans. Macedonian victories opened the way for Philip and Alexander to expand into Greece and then eastward. But every step was shadowed by the need to secure their Illyrian flank. The Illyrians, in turn, were drawn into a larger Mediterranean story. By fighting, resisting, and eventually joining Macedonian armies, they became part of the machinery that carried Hellenistic culture across the known world. So, when we talk about Bardylus's fall and Philip's rise, we're not just talking about one old king defeated by a younger rival. We're talking about a pivot point. Had Bardylus triumphed, Illyria might have dominated the Balkans, perhaps even shaped the course of Greek politics. Instead, Macedon rose, Illyria adapted, and the two remained entangled in a cycle of war and uneasy partnership. Picture the scene after Bardylus's defeat. The battlefield, strewn with Illyrian spears and Macedonian pikes, the air thick with smoke and dust. Philip, young and triumphant surveys the field, while Bardalus, age fallen but unbowed in legend, lies among his warriors. It was the end of one Illyrian dream, but not the end of Illyrian defiance. For even in defeat, they remained what they had always been: resilient, stubborn, and never quite willing to disappear. History, with its habit of spotlighting kings and generals, sometimes forgets to give space to the women who shaped empires. But every so often, a figure steps out of the shadows with such force that she can't be ignored. For the Illyrians, that figure was Queen Teuta, the pirate queen of the Adriatic, a woman who ruled with sharp eyes, sharper ships, and a willingness to defy the greatest power rising in the Mediterranean Rome. Teuta's story begins with her husband, King Agron of the Ardii, who ruled in the late 3rd century BC. Agron had forged one of the most powerful Illyrian kingdoms, yet commanding both land and sea. His fleet dominated the Adriatic, his armies struck deep into neighboring lands, and his court at Skadra gleamed with wealth. But in 231 BC, after celebrating a great victory with a little too much wine, a very Illyrian way to go, Agron died suddenly. Into this void stepped Teuta, not just as widow, but as regent for her young stepson Pin. And from the moment she took power, she showed that Illyrian kingship had found its queen. Teuta was not content to merely hold the throne until Pins came of age. She embraced her role with vigor. Understanding that Illyria's power rested on the sea, she expanded the navy and unleashed it on the Adriatic with ruthless efficiency. Her ships raided Greek colonies, intercepted merchants, and extended Illyrian influence as far south as Epirus and Corcyra, modern Corfu. Greek writers, who were rarely generous in their descriptions of barbarian women, grudgingly admit that Teuta was a formidable leader. To them, she was terrifying, a pirate queen whose fleet seemed to be everywhere at once. Piracy under Teuta wasn't random violence. It was policy. She treated raiding as a state-sanctioned enterprise. Captains received royal approval. Loot was shared systematically, and Illyria's treasury swelled with the proceeds. To Illyrians, this was smart governance. To Greeks, it was infuriating. And to Rome, whose merchants increasingly suffered from Teuta's raids, it was intolerable. In 230 BC, Greek cities desperate for relief appealed to Rome. And here is where Teuta's story leaps into the larger stage of Mediterranean history. Rome, freshly victorious in wars against Carthage and expanding its influence eastward, dispatched envoys to negotiate with the queen. What followed became one of the most infamous diplomatic exchanges of antiquity. The Roman ambassadors demanded that Teuta cease all piracy. According to later Roman accounts, and yes, we must take them with a pinch of propaganda salt, Teuta coolly replied that Illyrian law allowed individuals to engage in piracy as a legitimate form of private enterprise. Translation? Sorry, but raiding is basically a side hustle around here, and I can't tell my people to stop making a living. This might sound suspiciously like the ancient version of "it's not against the rules," if there aren't any rules. But then came the fatal mistake. One of the Roman envoys reportedly spoke too bluntly, insulting the queen. Teuta, unimpressed with Roman bravado, had him killed on the return journey. Now, if there's one golden rule of diplomacy with Rome, it's this: do not under any circumstances kill their ambassadors. That's like poking a bear, insulting it, and then stealing its honey. Rome does not forget. Rome does not forgive. Sure enough, in 229 BC, Rome launched the First Illyrian War. Consuls led legions across the Adriatic, Rome's first major military venture outside Italy. They captured Corcyra, secured Greek alliances, and marched north toward Skadra. Teuta fought fiercely, but the sheer scale and organization of the Roman war machine was something even her swift ships couldn't match. By 228 BC, she was forced to sue for peace. The terms were brutal. Teuta had to pay tribute, abandon most of her fleet, and withdraw from Greek territories. The once proud Illyrian kingdom was reduced, its power clipped by the very empire that would soon dominate the Mediterranean. Teuta herself was allowed to retain a small portion of her realm, but her days as Queen of the Adriatic were over. And yet, what a legacy. Teuta remains one of the few women in ancient European history to lead a kingdom into open conflict with Rome. She stands alongside Cleopatra and Boudica as one of those rare figures who defied the empire, however briefly, and carved her name into history. To the Romans, she was a pirate queen, dangerous and insolent. To the Illyrians, she was a leader who seized power when others hesitated and held it with daring. Picture her now, if you will, standing at the prow of a Liburnian ship, sea spray dampening her cloak, her eyes fixed on the horizon where Roman sails gather. Around her, warriors chant, drums beat, and the sharp scent of salt and pine fills the air. She knows the storm is coming, but she doesn't flinch. For a moment in history, the Adriatic belonged to her, the queen who ruled the waves. The clash between Rome and Illyria was never going to be a fair fight. On one side stood a people proud of their independence, fierce in their raiding and confident in their swift ships and rugged fortresses. On the other side stood Rome, already expanding beyond Italy, armed with disciplined legions and carrying the unshakable belief that their way of order must inevitably conquer chaos. When Queen Teuta's boldness tipped the scales by killing a Roman envoy, war became inevitable. In 229 BC, the First Illyrian War began. For Rome, this was historic, their first large-scale military campaign across the Adriatic. Two consuls, Gnaeus Fulvius Centumalus and Lucius Postumius Albinus, led an expeditionary force of around 20,000 troops, accompanied by 200 ships. That's right, Rome didn't just send a sternly worded letter. They sent nearly an entire navy. Teuta's pirate fleets had terrorized the sea lanes for years. Rome was determined to put an end to it in one dramatic stroke. The first targets were not Illyrian strongholds, but Greek cities caught in the middle. Corcyra, modern Corfu, long harassed by Illyrian raids, quickly switched allegiance to Rome. The Illyrian garrison stationed there surrendered without much of a fight, and the city welcomed the Romans as liberators. From there, the legions moved up the coast, striking at key points of Illyrian control. Epidamnos and Apollonia Greek colonies that had once suffered under Illyrian pressure also defected to Rome's side. For the Greeks, Rome's arrival felt like the long-awaited cavalry, though they would later discover that Roman protection came with permanent strings attached. Teuta tried to rally her forces. Her Liburnian ships darted in and out of harbors, harassing Roman supply lines, ambushing stragglers. But the Roman fleet was massive, and unlike Greek merchants, Roman captains were prepared to fight back. The Liburnians, sleek and fast, won a few skirmishes, but in open battle, they couldn't match the sheer scale of Roman naval power. Slowly, the Adriatic shifted from Illyrian waters to Roman waters. On land, the story was similar. Roman legions, drilled and disciplined, marched steadily northward. Illyrian warriors, brave but loosely organized, fought fiercely in ambushes and skirmishes. Yet the Romans pressed on, laying siege to fortresses, cutting off supply routes, and forcing tribe after tribe into submission. One of the fiercest confrontations came near Skadra, the Illyrian capital. Teuta held out as long as she could, but the weight of Roman steel was overwhelming. By 228 BC, the war was effectively over. Teuta sued for peace, and Rome dictated harsh terms. She was allowed to remain queen over a reduced domain around Skadra, but had to abandon all claims to Greek cities, pay an annual tribute, and surrender most of her fleet. To twist the knife further, the few ships she was allowed to keep were restricted. They could sail only south of Lissus, modern Lasia, and even then, only with a token crew. For a queen who had once ruled the Adriatic with swift, deadly galleys, this must have felt like being shackled to the shore. The impact of Rome's victory went far beyond Illyria. Greek states, especially those along the Adriatic and Ionian coasts, suddenly saw Rome not as a distant Italian power, but as an active player in their affairs. Corinth, Athens, and Sparta watched with wary eyes, realizing the legions might soon march their way. The First Illyrian War was a message Rome was coming east, and nothing, not even the pirate queen of the Adriatic, could stop them. But the Illyrians, stubborn as ever, didn't vanish quietly. After Teuta stepped back, new leaders rose. Demetrius of Pharos, once a Roman ally, later betrayed them and reignited piracy, forcing Rome into another conflict, the Second Illyrian War. The cycle of resistance and suppression would continue for decades. Rome might win battles, but the Illyrian spirit of independence flickered on like coals that refused to die out. Still, the First Illyrian War marked a turning point. For the first time, Illyria was forced to acknowledge Roman authority. For the first time, the Adriatic was no longer a purely Illyrian sea. And for the first time, the Romans planted their flag firmly in Balkan soil, a foothold they would expand until the entire region bowed to their empire. Picture Teuta standing on the walls of Skadra as the Roman standards approached. She had once ruled the waves her ships feared across the Adriatic. Now she watched as legionaries marched in disciplined lines, their armor gleaming, their confidence unshaken. For her, it was the end of an era. For Rome, it was the beginning of one. And for the Illyrians as a whole, it was a painful lesson. Their courage was boundless, their cunning legendary. But against Rome's relentless machine, even the sea wolves and mountain raiders would find their teeth blunted. The Illyrians had fought, raided, traded, and even defied Rome with the fierce confidence of a people who believed their mountains and seas made them unconquerable. But history, as always, has a way of grinding even the most stubborn cultures into something new. By the close of the 3rd century BC, the Illyrians were no longer free masters of the Adriatic. Rome had arrived, and with Rome came a new chapter 1 that would reshape Illyrian identity forever. After the First and Second Illyrian Wars, Illyria was no longer a threat, but a client state. Its fleets clipped, its borders watched. Some Illyrian kings tried to rebel. Demetrius of Pharos in 219 BC, Gentius of the Ardii in 168 BC. But each uprising ended the same way: a Roman victory. A new treaty, another nail hammered into the coffin of Illyrian independence. By the mid-2nd century, BC Illyrian territory was carved into protectorates, watched over by Roman governors. The people of the mountains and coasts who had once raided Greek merchants at will were now paying taxes to men in togas. And yet the Illyrians didn't vanish. Far from it. They adapted. Roman rule, harsh as it could be, brought roads, aqueducts, and new cities. Salona, near modern Split in Croatia, became the bustling Roman capital of Dalmatia, its streets lined with stone buildings, its amphitheater echoing with the roar of crowds. Roman colonies dotted the coast, linked by paved roads that cut through once wild mountains. Mines in Bosnia and Montenegro yielded precious metals for the empire worked by Illyrian labor. In war, the Illyrians found a new role as soldiers. The same ferocity that had once terrified Greeks and Romans alike was now harnessed in service of Rome. Illyrian warriors filled the ranks of the auxilia, the non-citizen units of the Roman army. They became scouts, cavalrymen, and shock troops, their skill in mountain and guerrilla warfare highly prized. To march under Roman standards was a strange fate for men whose fathers had fought against them, but it offered pay plunder and eventually citizenship. Many Illyrians seized that chance. Some did more than fight in legions. They rose to the very top. In the crisis-torn 3rd century AD, When Rome struggled to hold its empire together, several emperors of Illyrian origin came to power. Claudius Gothicus, who defeated the Goths, Aurelian, who restored the empire's fractured unity, and most famously, Diocletian, the reformer, who divided the empire into East and West, all hailed from Illyrian provinces. The men whose ancestors had been branded barbarians by Greeks and Romans now wore the purple robes of emperors. It is one of history's great ironies the uncivilized Illyrians ended up saving Rome from collapse. Culturally, two Illyrian traces persisted under Romanization. Rural communities clung to old rituals, hilltop sanctuaries, ancestral offerings, fertility cults, even as Latin inscriptions spread across the land. Pottery styles with animal motifs lingered beside Roman amphorae. The great goddess in new guises may have lived on in local cults long after her name was forgotten. The line between Illyrian and Roman blurred, and in that blur, a new identity slowly emerged. And what of their ultimate legacy? Here the debates begin. Some modern Albanians claim descent from the ancient Illyrians, seeing in them the deep roots of their language and culture. Others argue that Croats, Montenegrins, or other Balkan peoples carry Illyrian blood and traditions. Scholars continue to argue the evidence fragmentary, the connections tangled. Perhaps the truth is simple. The Illyrians live on in all the peoples of the Western Balkans, their legacy woven into language, folklore, and even place names. Dalmatia still recalls the Delmatae. Liburnian ship design lives in naval history. Shkodër and Durrës still echo with their ancient power. But more than names, their legacy is a spirit resilient, independent, tied fiercely to land and sea. They fought for centuries against stronger powers, never surrendering easily, never fading quietly. And when conquest finally came, they reshaped themselves, finding ways to survive, to thrive, and even to rule within the empire of their conquerors. So as our story of the Illyrians closes, imagine once more their homeland. The Adriatic glimmers at sunset, waves rolling softly against rocky shores. High in the mountains, the ruins of a fortress still stand, its walls broken, but proud-looking, down at valleys where goats graze and rivers wind silver paths. The voices of warriors, pirates, farmers, and queens may be silent, but the stones remember. The Illyrians are gone, yet not gone. Their blood marched east with Alexander west, with Rome, and flowed into the veins of the empire itself. Their ships became Roman ships. Their kings became emperors. Their lands became provinces, and their spirit became part of the long, tangled story of Europe. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember them not as footnotes in someone else's chronicles, but as a people who lived fiercely, left their mark, and whose echoes still linger in the hills and seas of the Balkans. The Illyrians' raiders, farmers' kings and queens, may have been swallowed by history, but they were never forgotten.